Okay, so I can't see anybody anymore, but if everybody can be muted, we'll get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the third walk in the series on Leinster Street. Before I start this one, I just want to acknowledge that we wouldn't all be here had it not been for Marcia Colvin. And today is her yard site. So I just thought I'd put that in there. So
we all loved her.
Yeah, for sure.
She was certainly the founder, but I'm so glad she found someone like you, Catherine, to carry on all that you do, and we miss her. So I'm glad you mentioned her.
Yeah. So this
She's just like Millie. She's just like Millie. Karen.
So if everybody can mute, it'll just make it easier for everyone to hear. So this program was developed with a St. John Community Arts Board grant, which you can see by the date. It's taken me a while to pull it all together. So Leinster Street, the photograph that's here is new to me. Louise Malota sent it in to me after last week's walk, so I thought I would add that in. And there's actually more snow in this picture than there is at the moment, but we're going to stay inside where it's nice and warm anyway. So Leinster Street is the home to the Synagogue and Museum, and was also the homes for the Brownberg family, the Hoffman family, the Goldbergs, the Goldsteins, and the Harris family. And in case you ever wondered where the name Leinster Street came from, the street was named for Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who was the second Earl of Leinster. He was stationed at Fort Howe in 1788, so just after the American Revolution. And he had served with the British Army and then later fought to free Ireland from British rule. And he was killed during that fight in 1798. So we'll start right here where I'm sitting at 91 Leinster Street, also known as Hillsley. And this structure was built by Charles Peters, a prominent city merchant, between 1897 and 1905. And he built this as a wedding gift for his wife, Fanny. So if there are any husbands in the crowd, maybe you're in trouble because maybe your wife's house wasn't quite as grand as all this. The outside of the house was built with a combination of sandstone and red brick. We've got some marble pillars around the entrance. And then inside the house, there's carving done by a local craftsman by the name of John Howe. So inside, everything is in oak. There's a reception hall, a drawing room, a dining room. There are 4 bedrooms upstairs, 8 fireplaces. They're all different. There's no 2 fireplaces the same. And the 2 main floor rooms have huge matching pocket doors that open and close. Charles Peters died in 1932. His wife died 10 years later. And at that point, the house changed hands and became the home of Senator Clarence and Frances Emerson. When they bought the house, the sale included the household furnishings and the Tiffany lamp that was in the window. So even though Senator Emerson was the highest bidder for the house, he had to pay an extra $3,000 to secure his bid. And the house sale almost fell through because the Peter's niece had thought she would like to keep the Tiffany lamp, and the Emersons very much wanted the lamp. So for the consideration of an extra $25, the niece relinquished the lamp and the Emersons bought the house. As you can imagine, that lamp is worth much, much more than $25, even in 1942. One of the main floor rooms we've called the Wedgwood room. And Mrs. Emerson had the idea of designing this room after seeing a Wedgwood room in the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, which was for the senators a private dining room. So she paid somebody to come and produce that, and a child's paintbrush had to be used to work in between the designs on the fireplace. Senator Emerson was the owner of Pascal Emerson's store on King Street. I'm sure we've all been in that building at one time or another, since they sold almost everything. And Senator Emerson died in 1963. After he died, his wife sold the building in 1964, and it became the Castle Funeral Home in 1964. And a piece was added to the back of the building to serve as the funeral chapel. And the building changed hands again in 2008 when the Jewish community purchased the building to replace the grand old synagogue on Carlton Street. So what was the funeral chapel became the synagogue. The remainder of the main floor became the exhibit space for the museum, which many of you have seen. And the second floor of the building, which was once bedrooms, was used by the funeral home as reception and office space.
I don't know.
And it's now being used as space if there's a bar mitzvah or another event. We have a place to sit and eat. Sometimes when my projects overflow my office, I can borrow some space upstairs, spread it out, sort it out, and then once it's contained, bring it back downstairs and that sort of thing. So
I don't know how to get out of it.
So the first stop on our walk is at 90 and 92 Leinster Street, just kitty corner across the street from the museum. So in terms of walking, we don't have to walk very far today. And this Leinster Street building is a multi-unit house. There are 5 apartments. And it was the home for the extended Bramberg family from the 1950s to the 1960s. And their children, Sylvia, Lila, and Gloria, and Adolf Bramberg's brother, Louis.
Oh, I can't get it.
So Adolf Bramberg, his dates are 1888 to 1963. And Adolf and Jenny Bramberg lived originally in St. John and Chipman Hill, near the current City Hall. And this was during the Second World War. And during the war, the Bramberg House was visited by more than 5,000 servicemen and servicewomen who passed through the city. And this activity started when one of the 3 daughters, I'm not sure which one, brought a Jewish serviceman home for a home-cooked meal. Over the years, the guests were treated to home-cooked meals, and many volunteered to wash up the dishes afterwards to say thank you. The Brambergs had a guest book, and there were signatures in the book from all over the world. And we have one of those books in the museum collection. The Brambergs also received letters from grateful mothers wanting to thank them for taking such good care of their children. After the meals were over and the dishes washed up, records would be put on the record player and there was dancing. On one of those evenings, the ceiling fell in just as the guests were moving to another room to have a meal. And then after the war, the captain and some of the crew members of the refugee ship Exodus were also welcomed and entertained by the family. Leonard Gomberg, their grandson, recalls, "We resided at 90 Leinster Street on the corner of Leinster and Wentworth, adjacent to what is now the Jewish Museum. My grandparents on my mother's side, Adolf and Jenny Bramberg, occupied half of the first floor of the house. The other half made up of Bram Business Service, where Adolf, his brother Louis, and my father, Ben Gomberg, worked as accountants. My parents, Ben and Gloria, my brothers Randy and Sandy, my sister Paula, and I occupied the entire upper floor of the house." So Adolf Bramberg had come to Canada in 1905 at the age of 17 from Austria. During the Second World War, he was actually living in Calgary, Alberta, and he was an official interpreter for the Canadian government and a censor for the post office, because of course they were monitoring the mail for any communications from the other side. He moved to St. John in 1918 and was manager for Crown Beverages and Bluebird Beverages. And one of these was the first local company to have a license to bottle Coca-Cola in St. John. During the Second World War, he was called back into military service as an interpreter and censor, and he was posted in Ottawa. At the same time as he was carrying out those duties, he studied accounting at Carleton College. And when he came home to St. John, he opened the Bram Business Service, so doing taxes and insurance. And as mentioned, his brother and son-in-law joined him in those activities. Jenny Bramberg who lived 1896 to 1990, was one of the 12 children born to Adolf and Esther Stern, who had a farm in South Bay, just west of the city. And she was a leader of Jewish Girl Guides in the 1930s and of Young Judea in the 1930s and 1940s. She took the Girl Guides to camps along the St. John River, where the girls learned to rough it. In the late 1940s, she accompanied campers to Camp Kadima, which is, I'm sure all of you know, was the Jewish summer camp in Nova Scotia, and she was cooking the meals there. She was also president of Hadassah in St. John in 1937. And during the war, as if she wasn't busy enough cooking all these meals and putting the ceiling back up on Chipman Hill, she was a volunteer at the Red Cross blood donor clinics. And she also was in charge of activities at the Jewish Servicemen's Center, which opened on Union Street in 1944 and 1945. So given how much was going on during the Second World War, I sort of think she probably didn't have a whole lot of time to sleep during those 6 years. Outside of the Jewish community, she was a convener of the Citizenship Committee for the local Council of Women and was named a life member of that organization in the 1960s. The Brownbergs were also active in Zionist affairs. They were given a Negev dinner in June 1963. So this recognized Mr. Brownberg's involvement with the local Zionist organizations. So he was a member of the Ezra Lodge, the Zionist Organization of Canada, the Israel Maritime League, and of B'nai B'rith. He was also a member of the St. John Board of Trade and the Independent Order of Oddfellows, which was some sort of fraternal men's organization. The Brownbergs did travel to Israel in the early 1960s, in October 1960, actually. And I actually have a picture of them in the office with David Ben-Gurion, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, and also with the mayor of Tel Aviv, who was there at the same time. And the Brownbergs had 3 daughters, Sylvia, Lila, and Gloria. So I'll talk about each of the daughters. There we go, on page. So Sylvia, during the Second World War, was involved with the Canadian Red Cross, and her duties took her to London, England after Victory in Europe Day, after VE Day, to work in the service centers. She saved up her cigarette rations and was able to sell enough of them to pay for a trip through Europe before returning home. She was married to Gus Garber in 1959 and moved to Montreal. And then after she was widowed, she remarried to Edward Easdam. And she had a child, Richard Garber, with her first husband. Gloria Bramberg, who we've already mentioned a little bit, was in St. John through the war, so helping her mother at the Jewish Servicemen's Center and on Chipman Hill. And she married Ben Gomberg. And they had 4 children, Paula, Randy, Sandy, and Leonard. And the family moved to California in 1962. So Leonard Gomberg, the only member, if you're not muted, if you could please mute yourself, just to make it a little easier to hear. The only member of this generation of the Gomberg family I'm connected to is the son Leonard. And he has some memories of growing up in St. John. And he wrote, for the most part, I truly enjoyed growing up there, especially in winter, as I loved going out in the snow, building snowmen and snow tunnels, and having snowball fights with the neighbors and passersby. Every summer, we would have a Brownberg family get-together with relatives from Montreal, Vineland, and sometimes as far away as Florida, coming around for the festivities. One summer, my Montreal cousins, Larry and Marcia Mogolansky, Randy and Sandy and I went for a walk around King Square and ended up returning with a small black cocker spaniel, which my mother named Poopsie, probably because of the mess it made on the floor the first night at home. So my mother put an ad in the paper. Nobody came by to claim the dog, and she became my pet. I used to get up every morning when the weather was warm at around 3 a.m. and take Poopsie for walks around the neighborhood. I called them cat hunts because whenever I saw a cat, I yelled at Poopsie to chase the cat, and of course she did. Cat hunts lasted for weeks until my mother caught me coming home one morning at around 5 a.m. and gave me the Dickens. Being part of the Jewish community was key to my life growing up in St. John. All my close friends were Jewish, and Adolf, his grandfather, made sure we learned and followed the Jewish customs and holidays. During that time, we went to services on Friday evening. I was very excited about going to California, but I got into trouble 2 days before we left in mid-December. I was throwing snowballs at passing cars, and one of them stopped, and the driver ran after me and caught me before I made it into the house. He threatened to take me to the police, but for some reason he didn't, and did not even go into the house to confront my parents. I will never forget growing up in St. John, because no matter the weather or the economy or the trouble I sometimes got into, as a kid, my major concerns were my friends, being adventurous, and watching hockey and Disney on television. I think that's a great memory of St. John. So the youngest child in the Bramberg family was Lila. And Lila was one of only a handful of female wireless operators in Canada. There were only 18 of them altogether. And she was posted in Ottawa from 1943 to 1945. So intercepting telegrams and phone calls and that sort of thing, signals. And then after VE Day, she was transferred to the west coast of Canada to do the same thing, to monitor enemy submarines from the Japanese side of things. She did have the opportunity to go to England, but her mother deemed it was too unsafe for her to travel overseas. However, she traveled from Ottawa to the west coast by a motorcycle, as you can see from the picture. And keep in mind, this was in the days before helmets and knee pads and other protective clothing. So I'm not sure how safe she really was. Lila married Alex Mogilonsky in 1950, and they moved to Montreal and then to Ontario, where she worked as an editor of magazines. She was also an artist and a video producer. And when she was living in St. John, she was the president of Maritime Young Judea sometime in the 1940s. So here we go. We're at 100 Leinster Street, which was the home of Meyer and Nellie Hoffman and their daughters Phyllis, Bernice, and Louise. And I'm just going to have a quick nod to the fact that on the upper floors of that house, there were other Jewish families. The Benjamin Gus family, before they moved around the corner to 70 Orange Street. So their three daughters do remember being in that house, and Karen shared with me being able to hear Louise playing and practicing the piano downstairs, and that this music was like a lullaby to help her drift off to sleep every night. As well as Jacob and Minna Brager lived in that building, as well as I think Jacob and Jenny Perchinock. So we can talk a bit about this house and people who were in it. So Meyer Hoffman, who lived from 1896 to 1975. He's pictured here with Nathan Rozovsky, and I also have one of the advertisements. So Meyer Hoffman was one of the city's most prominent tailors, and alongside his brother Benjamin Hoffman, they owned Hoffman Tailors on Main Street. Their tailoring skills had them placed as the leading tailor shop in the city, and it was said by many that a man who could wear a suit made at Hoffman's was one who had made it. Everything in the shop was made for individual customers. So here in the museum, we do have one of their order books, which includes each customer's measurements, choice of material, prices, everything's in there. And we have two suits that he made in our collection. One suit was made for a police detective in the city who donated it after he retired. And another was a suit worn for someone's graduation in 1970. We also have what's called a Prince Albert coat, which was made in 1934. And it was sort of a coat with long tails at the back. And it was a style that was favored by the local Roman Catholic clergy. One of the newspaper advertisements for the shop noted the address is 695 Main Street, that it opened in 1911. And so it had this slogan, always well abreast of the times, Hoffman custom tailored suits or coats assure the latest styles, newest materials, and perfect fitting garments. So Meyer married Nellie Stern on March the 1st, 1927. And as you know, this is a small and close-knit community. So Nellie Hoffman is the sister of Jenny Bramberg. So they were sisters living next door as neighbors. Most of the Stern family, so Nellie's parents, Jenny's parents, had relocated to Vineland, New Jersey, but they did leave 3 of the daughters in St. John. So Nellie Hoffman was a member of Hadassah and Sisterhood in the Jewish community. And at some point, she did send 2 short stories to a CBC literary contest. The first one was called The Wireless to Kaiser Wilhelm. And this recounted the story of a police visit to the family on the South Bay farm during the Second World War. Because in those days, all the phones were party lines, and a neighbor had heard Mr. Stern speaking on the phone in German. So, of course, there was this tremendous concern that the Stern family were actually spies for the enemy. And once the officials realized that Mr. Stern was no risk to national security, he was engaged as a translator for the duration of the war. So I guess some good came out of that. The other story was called The Blizzard and How Nellie Got Her Red Nose. I don't have the details on that story, but I do know from an oral interview we have in our collection that she really did not like the cold winter weather. So that may be perhaps what that story is about. Nellie Hoffman was also someone who wrote letters to the editor of the newspaper, and a letter that she wrote in January of 1980 concerned the removal of the benches at the bus stop near King's Square, which I'm sure we've all spent time at. She was hoping to sit while awaiting for the next South End bus after a shopping excursion, to gather gifts and party needs to celebrate her 7-year-old granddaughter's birthday. Her letter gave a wonderful description of the purchases and her walk through the city, but today there are still not really any benches. So even 40 years on, her plea fell upon some pretty deaf ears. And the Hoffmans had 3 daughters. This is a photograph of the Hoffmans. It was their wedding photograph. They married in New York. They actually eloped on the 1st of March, 1927. And Nellie also belonged to the Women's Symphony Committee and the Ladies' Morning Musical Club. So they had 3 daughters, Bernice, Phyllis, and Louise, and all of them are graduates of St. John High School from the classes of 1944, 1946, and 1953. So Bernice, the oldest, earned a master's degree in biochemistry from Dalhousie University. And by 1953, she was living in New York and had received a scholarship to study art for the Art Students League of New York. And she had also studied art in St. John under prominent city artists, including Miller Britton and Julia Crawford. Phyllis went on to study nursing and graduated from the Jewish Hospital School of Nursing in Philadelphia in 1949. The newspaper reported that she placed 2nd in the New Brunswick nursing exams in December 1950. She married Morris Sivan in June 1954, and they would move to Brookline, Massachusetts, and then on to California. And while I was researching this, I came across this interesting bit of information that Dr. Morris Sivan, her husband, had been presented to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, at the official opening of Queen Elizabeth College in London, England in August 1961, where he was then working. So nice royal connection. Phyllis Hoffman has since passed away. She died in 2002 at the age of 92. And then the 3rd daughter, Louise, began formal piano lessons at the age of 5. And her first lessons were with a newly arrived young piano teacher, Alice May Eccles, who had come from British Columbia. During the 10 years that followed, she also studied the violin, although the piano became her instrument. Louise joined the St. John Symphony Orchestra under Kelsey Jones in 1950, when she was only 14, and was placed in the 2nd violin section. And she remembered the experience with these words, quote, "The first time I ever heard a live orchestra performing a Beethoven symphony, I was playing in it. I cannot describe the intense thrill this gave me. Playing in the St. John Symphony changed my life. So she continued her piano studies at the Royal Conservatory of Music. And then she went on to study in Geneva and Zurich, and she has taught and performed in many countries around the world. And this list includes Norway, Trinidad, St. Vincent, St. Kitts, Dominica. While she was in Europe, she met her husband, Edward Malota, who was an American industrial designer who lived in Detroit for a couple of years. And then from 1973 to 1989, they were living back in St. John, where Edward Malota was the chief designer at the New Brunswick Museum. And so their children has the opportunity to spend some of their growing up years in St. John. Edward Malota also did design work for Expo 67 in Montreal. And Louise was busy teaching piano and was involved with the New Brunswick Music Festival and the New Brunswick Registered Music Teachers Association. So ultimately, all three, the sisters ended up in California. And I understand that Louise is still teaching, performing, and volunteering in the community. So that's pretty amazing. Our next stop, we're zigzagging a bit back and forth across the street, but this is 103 Leinster Street, which was the home of the Goldberg family. So Abe and Ruth Goldberg, Ben Goldberg, and Candace Goldberg. And if anybody's into architecture, this is a 3-story brick building with projecting bay windows and pretty fancy. I actually know a couple of people who live in this building today. So the Goldbergs lived in this building from about 1950 to the middle of the 1960s. Abraham Goldberg was born in Badzenau, Poland, and he was the son of Ozer and Miriam Goldberg. He had 8 siblings, including a brother Yankel and a sister Sarah Brim. His sister Sarah and her husband Max were already living in St. John when Abe Goldberg arrived here from Poland. And it was Max who gave Abraham his first home in St. John and his first job. The rest of the Goldberg family, Abe Goldberg's parents and the other 7 siblings, all died in Poland as victims of the Holocaust. Abe Goldberg was a well-known tailor and furrier. He worked first for Imperial Cloak Company and then went on to own his own businesses, the Superior Ladies Tailoring on Charlotte Street, and then Progress Tailors and Furriers on Princess Street. He was a dedicated volunteer in the Jewish Museum. He sorted and identified boxes of Hebrew books and participated in events. He was a regular attendee at Sabbath services, and in keeping with the Orthodox tradition, he walked from his uptown home to the synagogue well into his senior years. He also took on roles and played staged by the Jewish community players and participated in a congregational choir. Abe Goldberg married twice. He married Esther on June the 4th, 1928, as you can see here, and they had a son, Benjamin, who was born in 1930. Esther tragically died in 1935, and Abe Goldberg later remarried Ruth and had another child, a daughter, Candace. So Benjamin Goldberg, Dr. Benjamin Goldberg, was a graduate of St. John High School, the University of New Brunswick, Dalhousie University, and the Menninger School of Psychiatry in Topeka, Kansas. When he graduated from high school, he received the St. John Corporation Gold Medal in 1945, and he was a Beaverbrook Scholar at UNB. He later was director of the Developmental Disabilities Program and professor of neuropsychiatry at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. He worked as a specialist with mentally handicapped and emotionally disturbed children, and continued to work even into retirement with developmentally disabled adults. He has received distinguished awards from the Ontario Association on Developmental Disabilities and is a senior member of the Canadian Medical Association. And he's with us today. And just as a side note, his son also became a doctor. Not a psychiatrist, though. And then 104 Leinster Street was the home of the Goldstein family, Ben and Ida Goldstein, and their daughters Rosalind and Janet. I have a little bit on the history of the structure itself. So the building dates from 1915. It was built originally for John Seeley, who was a wholesale fish dealer, and he was importing and exporting fish to the West Indies and South America. And he had fish drying sheds on the straight shore where Chesley Drive is today, so maybe he had some connection to McCormick and Zatzman. The brick house itself is built in the Edwardian classical style, and with all sorts of interesting detail and kind of a unique door. Instead of facing the street directly, you go in at the side. So the Goldsteins lived in this building from the mid-1950s to the 1980s. So Ben Goldstein, another person at the piano, was the son of Philip and Rose Goldstein. He had a sister Bertha and a brother Maurice. He married Ida Friedman, and they had two daughters, as I mentioned. In his younger years, Ben Goldstein played piano with a number of dance bands, but later established Ben Goldstein's Music Center, where he sold sheet music, instruments, and records to several generations of customers. He began his studies in St. John under Moses Ewing and continued for a short time at the conservatories in Boston, but the teachers there told him his left hand was too heavy. He had begun his career playing music for the silent movies in the early 1920s in the Imperial Theater and at the Opera House on Union Street. And he also accompanied a theater stock group known as the Central Players. After the talkies came in, he turned to playing dance music in New Brunswick and Maine. And he was a member of a 16-piece orchestra under the direction of Alfred Jones. And he also played with Bruce Holder. He played at dances around the city, including the YWAJ, where he met his wife, Ida Friedman. When he opened the store, it was at 105 Union Street in 1932. And in the newspaper story, you kind of see in the picture, he recalled that his first sale was a guitar string, which went for 15 cents. And he had made the sale in the middle of the night when he was working to get everything ready for opening day. He had decided to open in order to have a better service for ordering sheet music. So there were some challenges. He's opening a store in the middle of the Depression, but it turned out to be a very successful venture. Later, the store relocated to 101 Charlotte Street, and this was where generations of St. John residents bought their sheet music, recorded music, records, and perhaps also their instruments and accessories. Ben Goldstein handled the music for the New Brunswick Competitive Festival of Music, which was held each spring in St. John. And as he said in the newspaper, that was a big job. There were so many types of music. And after the store closed, music had to be ordered directly from the companies. The store did close for good in 1975, and a story that ran in the newspaper at the time of the closing included some anecdotes from the store's career. So the story goes on to say, another incident which sticks in his mind occurred when a well-dressed gentleman walked into my store and he said, "You have some lovely records in the window." He asked me to ship him some records, and I said, yes. And he said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "Yes, you're Lord Beaverbrook." This incident occurred in the late 1950s and was the first of several subsequent visits made by this famous Canadian. And then the newspaper story concluded with this. Speculating on musical trends in the future, Ben Goldstein said, "There's the beginning of a trend now back to jazz. Benny Goodman, Guy Lombardo. I see it in the store. Older folks bring in their children who return to purchase records of artists of bygone days." Mr. Goldstein said he does believe the long-playing records will never become obsolete. And we know we got that right. I mean, we went through cassettes and then CDs, and now everything's back on long-play records again. But of course, the records are now incredibly expensive to buy, so he might be a bit shocked by the prices that record collectors may be paying. Ida Goldstein was the daughter of Abraham and Mary Friedman. Her sister was Ann Holtzman, and we talked about her last week when we were on King Street East. And she had three brothers, Jack, Bernard, or Rube, and Ben. So she did help out in the music store from time to time. And they had two daughters, so Janet and Rosalind. Rosalind was a graduate of McGill University. She married George Avery in 1960. And she worked initially as a teacher and then went into the real estate business. Janet graduated from Mount St. Vincent Academy in Halifax, was also a teacher, married Alan Stern in 1966, and lived in Halifax for their working time and have now relocated to Vancouver, British Columbia.
Beautiful picture.
And then we have one. This is our last stop. This walk's much shorter than the last one. 105 Leinster Street, which was the home for the Harris family. So Saul and Lillian Harris and their daughters, Dina and Paula. So Saul Harris was born in Poland in May 1918. His parents were Meyer and Dina Hariski. And he was one of 9 children, 4 older sisters and 4 younger brothers. And out of that family, he was sadly the only survivor. After the Nazi occupation of Poland in 1939, the family was forced into the ghetto, where they lived in crowded conditions without adequate food or accommodations. And Judenrat, that was in charge of the ghetto, was often forced to gather the valuables to ensure everyone's survival. The ghetto was liquidated in 1942, and all but 300 of the Jews in the community were taken to Treblinka, where they were immediately gassed and burned. One of the men who managed to escape from Treblinka reported that no one had survived. Saul Harris was among those selected to dismantle the ghetto and gather what was left. Once this was completed, he labored first on the railroad and then in an ammunition plant. His job was to load the trucks. His brother had also survived and was put to work, but he was working directly with the sulfur that was used in the ammunition. And once he got sick, he was killed. Saul Harris was taken on a death march to Buchenwald in February of 1945 and was liberated there in April of 1945. And he described this as a happy day. When the war was over, he went to Austria, where he sold watches, and he took courses to learn how to be a tailor. He was told there were jobs for tailor in North America. So in 1948, he traveled by ship to Halifax and then came on to St. John because he was told there was work here. He changed his surname to Harris. And then once on his arrival, he worked for a short time for Jacob Cohen. And he was boarding with Jacob's son, Ted, and his wife, Sadie Cohen on Winter Street. And while he was living there, he met Lillian Zatzman, and they were married on the 5th of July in 1949. Shortly afterwards, they opened Harris Men's and Boys Wear, first on Prince Edward Street and then on Union Street. And the store closed in 1979. So I will add that Saul Harris seldom spoke about his experiences because they were too painful. They did manage to have an interview with him on the CBC in 1985, and he told the reporter that he could never forget what happened. Lillian Zatzman Harris was one of the 6 children born to Jacob and Tilly Zatzman, and she had 3 sisters, Sophie Sandler Richmond, Miriam, and Shifra, and there were 2 brothers, Meyer and Charles. The Zatzman family owned McCormick and Zatzman, which operated the fish sheds along Chesley Drive. And they exported fish, potatoes, and other goods. During the Second World War, Lillian joined the Canadian Women's Army Corps and was posted to Edmonton, Alberta in 1944, where she was working as a secretary. Although she served for less than a year, she was proud of the service that she had given. After her marriage, she worked alongside her husband in the store on Union Street. After retirement, they lived in Toronto from 1986 to 2003, and then came back to St. John. And Lillian Harris was noted as somebody who did needlepoint, and she was also quite a bingo and card player. This is a family picture that includes the daughters. So Dina graduated from St. John High School in 1971. She was active in sports, and one of the things that she participated on was the St. John Women's Softball League. She had a career as a teacher. She married Tom Pizer, and she has one son, Brent, and two beautiful grandchildren. Paula graduated from St. John High in 1973 and spent her career working in the St. John hospitals. She is married to Mike Power, and they have one son, Jeremy. And the community involvement that both Dina and Paula were engaged in earned them Duke of Edinburgh Awards in 1970. So that's the end of our walk down Leinster Street. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here. And I'm hoping once I stop sharing my screen that you'll share your comments, suggestions, memories, so that I can add to this walk. So when I do it again, I'll have some more stories to tell. And just remind you of the series. We've already been down Orange Street, King Street East, and today Leinster Street. Next Wednesday, we're going to walk down Elliott Row. And then we'll take a break for a week. Gives me time to get things ready for the next 3 walks, which will all be based in the Sharezetic Cemetery, where we'll talk about the war veterans, the Jewish merchants on Main Street, and then a walk entitled Murder, Illness, and Accidents. So people who died before their time. And then we'll take another break for Passover and come back and take a walk up one side and down the other of Summer Street. And just going to remind everybody of our upcoming summer exhibit, Coming of Age, Bar Mitzvah, and Bat Mitzvah celebrations. So I'm hoping you'll share your memories, whether it's your event or someone else's, invitations, photographs, kippas, and other memorabilia, so that we can make this a really great exhibit.